Welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue our study of intermolecular forces by focusing on what we call dispersion forces. These forces arise due to the polarizability of all molecules and are a function of the polarizability and the size, the shape of those molecules, and the distance between those molecules. So we've looked already at ions and dipoles, and when those molecules or ions interact with each other. But it turns out that if you have nonpolar molecules or atoms, which are nonpolar, then they can interact with each other through intermolecular forces as well, electrostatic intermolecular forces. So electrons are in constant motion about the molecules in which they're contained. Because of this, at any given moment, you might have an uneven distribution of electron density throughout the molecule. In the image in the middle, we might assume that we have a perfectly symmetrical electron density around the molecule. But if at any moment there are more electrons on the right-hand side than there are on the left, then that's going to create a temporary dipole. If there's more electrons on the left than there are on the right, we have a similar effect, but in the opposite direction. And so in any and every molecule, we can have instantaneous and temporary dipole moments. These instantaneous dipole moments can induce a dipole moment in a neighboring atom or molecule. This results in an induced dipole interaction. And these interactions that involve induced dipoles are known as London dispersion forces. And they depend on what's called the polarizability of a molecule and its distance. We'll talk about polarizability in just a moment. Because nonpolar molecules can induce dipoles in other nonpolar molecules, it makes sense that we would expect ions and permanent dipoles to also be able to induce dipole moments in these nonpolar species. Here's an example of an ion-induced dipole interaction. If we have hydrogen molecule, put a sodium atom near it, the positive charge on that sodium atom is going to attract the electrons on the hydrogen molecule towards it. That's going to create an attractive interaction that we would call an ion-induced dipole. Then we can have dipole-induced dipole interactions. Say you have a water molecule that comes nearby a hydrogen molecule. In this case, the negative end of the water molecule might come near the hydrogen molecule. It's going to repel the electrons from that side of the molecule, in this case the right, over towards the left. That's going to create a temporary dipole and therefore an attraction between the hydrogen molecule and the water molecule. We could have had a similar effect where the positive end of the water molecule got near the hydrogen and it would attract the electrons towards it. Notice in both cases that the strength of the intermolecular force is dependent upon the identities. We have our the charged species and the induced dipole, and then it is inversely proportional to some distance between them. In the ion-induced dipole, it's a factor of 4. Dipole-induced dipole, it's a factor of 6. So what we see is that in the case of the dipole-induced dipole, is going to be a lot weaker than ion-induced dipoles. Finally, looking back at our induced dipole, we see that this is dependent upon the polarizability of those molecules and the distance between them. And so these interactions are going to be very, very weak. Now let's talk about polarizability. The way you can think about polarizability is the ease in which a molecule can be polarized, in which the electrons can be moved from one side of the molecule or atom to the other. So if you have large, heavy molecules or atoms where the electrons are held out farther from the nucleus, it's easier to move those around. Therefore, those molecules are going to be more polarizable. And dispersion interactions contribute to the intermolecular forces in all substances. Again, because all substances can have their electron clouds distorted, whether it's a polar molecule, a nonpolar molecule, or an ion, we're always going to have dispersion forces present. So let's revisit an earlier problem. When we looked at calcium chloride interacting with ethanol, we talked about how we could have ion-ion interactions, ion-dipole interactions, and dipole-dipole interactions. But now we know that we can also have induced dipole type interactions. So we can have ion-induced dipole interactions between the ions and nonpolar regions of the molecule, or even in fact the polar regions of the molecule. We also have dipole-induced dipole, and we can get induced dipole-induced dipole. So we talked about how dispersion forces depend upon the polarizability. We can think of this again as the squishiness, the ease in which we are able to distort the electron cloud. And when you look at the noble gases, for example, we can see that xenon has a much higher boiling point than argon does. And the reason for that is because it's easier to distort the electrons in the larger xenon atom. Now you try and you think about this. Which of these molecules would have the highest boiling point, which would have the lowest? So rank these in order of increasing boiling point. Pause the video and try this on your own. Welcome back. So how do we think about this? Well, we know that the boiling point increases with increasing size. So all we need to do is to rank these in terms of their size. Molecule number 3 is the smallest. Molecule number 1 is the largest. And indeed, when we look at the actual boiling points of these substances, we see that they follow our prediction. So London dispersion forces also depend upon the surface area of the molecules. The larger the surface area, the more contact area between two different molecules, the more they're able to interact. So if we were to take two different isomers, so molecules with the same molecular formula, but these are constitutional isomers. They have different shapes. The isomer that is more long is going to have more surface area than ones that are clumped up and have atoms that are kind of hid away in the center of the whole molecule. And so therefore the molecules that are more compact, more stumpy, are going to have fewer interactions. Here's an example. We have N-pentane and neopentane. These are two different isomers, same molecular formula, but different structure. So which of these would we expect to have the higher boiling point? Did you guess N-pentane? I hope so. Because N-pentane is longer, it has more surface area to interact with other molecules, and therefore it's going to have more dispersion forces and therefore a higher boiling point. Dispersion forces are vital for living systems. They help, in this case we see here we have a steroid molecule that's interacting with the fatty acid lipid bilayer in a cell membrane. And the dispersion forces that exist between the large nonpolar steroid are interacting with the large nonpolar regions of the fatty acids, and that will stabilize the molecule. Dispersion forces we also see within DNA. They are a large majority of what stabilize the DNA double helix. Finally, we need to be able to compare analogous molecules. So if you look here, we have 6 different molecules, and they all have a very similar molar mass, but they vary widely in terms of their boiling points. What we also notice is that they have very different dipole moments. And so for molecules that have similar mass and shape, we can differentiate their strength and their intermolecular forces by looking at their dipole moments. So here's another example. In this case, however, we have a large increase of molar mass going between hydrogen chloride, hydrogen bromide, and hydrogen iodide. The molar mass goes up, but the dipole moment goes down. Yet, we see an increase in boiling point. And so for covalent molecules that differ very largely in their molar mass, then the differences in the intermolecular forces are going to rely mostly upon the molar mass, but dipole moment can still be a factor. And in fact, this brings us to an example, hydrogen fluoride. It is very light relative to the others, but it has a much higher boiling point. And this is because of what we call hydrogen bonding. And we'll explore that in the next video. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.